I'd like to give the floor to the chairman of the committee, Ms. Spies. Thank you, and very cordial welcome to you all, especially to our commissioning parties and to the persons interested who are looking in on this on Bonaire, Sint Eustatius and Caba. Bon dia, good morning. Today we present the conclusions of the evaluation. As you know, on the 10th of October 2010, the Netherlands Antilles were dismantled. Bonaire, Sint Eustatius and Saba were each given the status of a public entity within the Netherlands. In the run-up to this transition, it was agreed that the elaboration of the new constitutional structure would be evaluated after 5 years. The deputies for constitutional matters and the Secretary General of the Ministry of the Interior and Kingdom Relations have commissioned us to carry out this evaluation. I do apologize for not introducing the members of the committee to you. From the left, for me, Mr. Glenn Today, Mr. Fred Zoons, Mr. Frans Wekers and Mr. Luc Verheij. I have to say we hardly knew each other before we started this job, and now we have sometimes at a breakneck speed, but unanimously found each other. Thank you very much for our cooperation. The commissioning parties asked the Council of State for information that also followed the basis for the terms of reference of the committee. The committee has been asked to look in an independent manner at the working of the legislation, the functioning of the new administrative structure, and the consequences of this transition for the population. Today we are presenting our conclusions. The order for the committee was quite extensive, and in three independent examinations were conducted, for which 3 research bureaus were called in. The research into legislation was carried out by Pro Facto, the examination of the administration by the DSP group, and the examination of the consequences for the population was carried out by the Netherlands Institute for Social Research. And each of those examinations was monitored by a monitoring committee consisting of members of the evaluation committee and experts, for instance, in the area of legislation, or specifically coming from the islands themselves. The committee would like to thank the researchers and the monitoring committees for their efforts. As much information as possible was gathered on Bonaire, Sint Eustatius and Saba and in the European Netherlands. The committee considers it to be very important that the islanders have also been listened to and heard properly. So we've not only conducted discussions with governors and civil servants, telephonic questionnaires were answered, focus groups were organized, and walk-in hours were held. Also, we've called on people via advertisements and radio spots to share their experiences with the constitutional renewal. We've also discussed things with entrepreneurs and civil society organizations, and apart from that, the committee itself has also conducted many discussions. That's why today we would like to extend our gratitude to everybody who's taken the trouble, either via the website, to react, to come to the walk-in hours, or who has wanted to share their experiences with us in any way whatsoever. Without all of this information, our work would not have been really possible properly. At the same time, so much information has been gathered that it's almost impossible to share the information with you. And even so, it turned out to be quite difficult to make a comparison with the situation 5 years ago. This is also due to the fact that at the time, baseline measurements were conducted in hardly any fields. I'll share our main conclusions with you. Let me start with legislation. The legislative operation in the run-up to 10-10-10 was huge and quite a complex job. Both the ministries and the islands have made great efforts within a very limited time span. We also agreed for the next 5 years then not to implement any new legislation on the islands, the so-called legislative restraint. The idea was that with the transition there were so many things that were going to change that it was desirable to mark time. In spite of the intention to exercise restraint in the introduction of new legislation, there is a feeling on the islands that since the 10th of October 2010 a lot of new rules have become applicable. And that feeling is something we recognize. For on balance, a lot of amended legislation, and in some cases entirely new legislation, has been made, particularly in the areas on which the effects of this are felt quite immediately by the islanders themselves in everyday lives. When making new legislation and rules, the islands must be consulted. This will enable the islands whether sufficient account is taken of the specific characteristics of the islands. The consultation that took place, broadly speaking, was not a success really. Ministries have formally offered the islands the opportunity for consultation, but in practice it was hardly fleshed out. This was to do with time pressure, limited capacity, expertise, experiences and skills, also on the islands. While the consultations are going better now, the limited capacity and the unbalanced relation with The Hague continue to be points requiring attention. Also, it often remains unclear what is done with the contents of the consultation. When making legislation, it's possible to make differences between the islands themselves and the European Netherlands. In practice, however, we see that this is hardly used, this possibility. On the other hand, we see that differences arise with European Netherlands legislation. Now, why those differences are there is often not explained properly, and this is felt as being arbitrary, especially on the islands. The enforcement and implementation of many laws has definitely improved in many areas. A good example would be the tax collection, the functioning of the tax and customs administration, but this also results in a lot of complaints. However, where before the transition you could have inconsistency and arbitrariness, we now more often have more uniformity in the implementation and more consistency as well. And more often, the efforts of European Netherlands inspectorates relating to the enforcement of legislation are mentioned in a positive sense. This brings me to the second part. This relates to the administration. We have come to the following conclusions there. Here too, both by the three islands and the central government, a great deal of time, money and energy has been invested in turning the transition into a success. Differences in language, scale and culture at once complicate the cooperation between Bonaire, Sint Eustatius, Saba and the central government. As far as the central government is concerned, it is observed that there is no integral approach. The policy and the relevant financing are fragmented, and the knowledge of the specific circumstances on Bonaire, Sint Eustatius and Saba is often limited. The exercise of central government responsibilities by the National Office for the Caribbean Netherlands is seen as relatively positive. It is indicated, though, that in the performance of duties and service provision, there isn't always a sufficient sense of local circumstances, and sometimes the situation on site is viewed too much from a Dutch perspective. The inhabitants of the three islands did not feel strongly represented in the relation with the European part of the Netherlands. and the inhabitants of Bonaire, St. Eustatius and Saba don't recognize themselves in the House of Representatives and the Senate. The way in which the political debate in European Netherlands is conducted is such that on the islands it is not felt as if their interests form an explicit part of this debate.
Expressar suficientemente del debate.
The islands can in this light not be confused with decisions. The interests of the islands have not been weighed sufficiently.
Pode não estar insco decisão por isso que não tem ficar com interesse na warto não só também o funcionamento de governo.
Within these 5 years, the administrative practice and culture have not changed essentially yet. The separation of in which there is an important role for the Island Council does not stand out clearly yet. As a result, there is still insufficient democratic checking by the Island Council of the Governing Council. The administration itself is vulnerable and not of the required quality yet. The small scale of the islands and the limited available capacity make it difficult to sustainably warrant the quality of the administration and the official organization. This makes the situation strongly dependent on the efforts and quality of individual persons. And as a result, the administrative power per island and per governing council may vary strongly. We also see that over the course of the past few years, relations between the central government and the 3 islands have sometimes hardened. We see that in relation with St. Eustatius and to a lesser extent with Bonaire. Administrators are at loggerheads with each other, and the debate very often is about the allocation of tasks and powers. Agreements that have been made are not always clearly or are interpreted differently. The most telling example is the agreement to reach a standard of services and provisions that is acceptable within the Netherlands. You see that in those fields where this agreement was not elaborated sufficiently concretely, this is often a source of different expectations and also a source of disappointment. Well, then of course we've also looked at the consequences of these changes since 10-10-10 for the population of the islanders. Fortunately, we have also achieved positive results, especially in the area of healthcare and education. This is also experienced as such by the islanders themselves. The committee has concluded that successes have particularly been achieved in areas where the plans are ambitious and the agreements are concrete. In other areas, there are still disappointments and there's dissatisfaction. For instance, the safety has not improved appreciably. There are deficiencies in the maintenance of the physical infrastructure, and the most noticeable is the problem of poverty. The level of social provisions is low, and the purchasing power for many has declined, especially weaker groups in society, such as the elderly and single mothers, can get into trouble as a result. Sometimes these concerns are so huge that they almost completely overshadow the progress that has definitely been made. The concerns about everyday existence make people lose the view of positive elements. Of course, it must be noted that not all those developments are related to the transition that was started since the 10th of October 2010. As in the European Netherlands, Bonaire, St. Eustatius and Saba have been affected by a global economic and financial crisis. These 3 islands and the European Netherlands lack a shared approach which offers prospects for future economics development for each of the islands. So, summarizing then, a great deal of work was done over the past 5 years. Expectations were high. At the moment, regrettably, There is widely felt disappointment about the balance. It is still not positive. Expectations only were realized partly. This can be attributed largely to the level of prosperity on the islands. Since 2010, the standard of living has fallen for many people, including those with jobs. Relations have also been tested in the past 5 years. Relations of trust have come under pressure as a result. The balance is not yet favorable after 5 years. At the same time, however, 5 years is a short period, of course, and it is too early for a final judgment. The implementation of the transition is still in full progress. The committee would like the results of the evaluation to provide a spur to bring the original objectives of the constitutional change closer within the next few years, not to look back and to underline 25 times whatever has not been a success yet, but to take on board the experiences as inspiration for the coming period, to do things differently and better. That requires the commissioning parties, while maintaining the dialogue with the islanders, to make joint concrete agreements and to agree on measures and implement them in order together to ensure a sustainable socio-economic development which is in the interest of the inhabitants of Bonaire, St. Eustatius and Saba. The committee hopes that the evaluation will provide a sufficient basis for this. Thank you.